There were over 300 people on board the Kanishka Flight AI-182. There were adults, there were children, there were infants, and there was a cabin crew. Some were probably going on a vacation, others were probably going to meet family, some were maybe taking their newborn babies to meet their grandparents back home. None of the 331 people had any idea that 5 hours into the flight, they would become the victims of the worst terror attack in the world until 9/11. We take the next 1 hour to go over the Justice BN Kirpal report, which has been exclusively accessed by NewsX. For the first time in 37 years, people will finally be able to know and read what these 331 innocent lives went through in those last moments. To take us through the report, I also have with me Dr. PSV Rao, who will serve as a medical expert as we go over this aspect of the report. Let's put this on our screens. We're on page number 64 of the Justice BN Kirpal report. This page refers to injuries to persons. It would be helpful if we can actually put our, yes, thank you. It says injuries to persons. Post-mortem examination was carried out by Irish authorities at Cork, which is where, close to this of course, is where the plane, once it exploded, it crashed and it landed. I don't know, we can remove me from the screen. Let's put the papers on the screen if we can. At that time, Wing Commander Dr. I.R. Hill was also present. Subsequently, Air Vice Marshal Kunzru also reached Cork. Both of them were members of the medical group which had been constituted by Mr. H.S. Khola. By then, 131 bodies of the over 300 people who were on board the flight had been recovered. None of these bodies of the flying crew were actually recovered at this point. The bodies which were recovered represented 39.8% of the victims. The exact seating position of the passengers is not certain, because if it's not known whether any of these passengers changed their seats or not. Let me now show you a quick breakup, if we can, of the seats. There was a zone A, a zone B, an upper deck, and 3 other zones. The subtotal was 337, out of which 301 adults were on board and 6 infants were also on board, of which at this point 117 bodies were identified. So zone A and zone B, which were sort of your upper class, your business class, premium class, out of the 16 and 22 seats that were available, only 1 was occupied, the rest were not occupied. In the upper deck, out of 18 seats, 7 were occupied, and mainly in zone D, E is where most of your passengers were actually sitting. Then of course, this is the flight crew. On the flight deck, the seats available were 3 and 3 of those were occupied. In the cabin, there were 19 seats available and 19 were occupied. Out of a total of 329 were occupied. It further says that the post-mortem reports were examined by Wing Commander Dr. Hill. He submitted 2 reports being exhibits H1 and H2. He was also examined in court as witness number 2. Dr. Hale, who had developed a system which would indicate the severity of the accident and injuries suffered. He used a scale from 0 to 4, with not being no injury and 4 being a fatal lesion. Though there is some amount of subjectivity involved in this system, nevertheless, categorizing the injuries according to the scale does not give an overall picture of what had happened to the victims. And here, of course, is your understanding of the mild, moderate, severe and catastrophic injuries as has been mentioned in this report. And of course, Dr. Hale has given a further detailed breakup of what happened to the people. But let's go over some of the other details before I bring in Dr. Rao. The reports as submitted by Dr. Hale further indicate as follows. there were 30 children recovered and they showed less than overall injury. The average severity of the injury increases from zone C to zone E and is significantly less in zone C than in zones D and E. So remember viewers, I did put out what the zones were like. So zone A, B and the upper deck were hardly, there were 8 people there, but zone C, this is zone C, D and E were mostly occupied. From what this report indicates, those sitting in zone C had significantly less injury, but some amount of injury than those in zone D and E. Dr. Rao, what's truly heartbreaking here, sir, is of course the figure of the 30 children and some 6 infants who were on board this flight, and the terrorists who were responsible obviously paid no heed to the fact that these were innocent lives that they were taking.
Yes, Devika, good evening to you and your viewers. There was also a pregnant lady who had injuries and had drowned, and whose infant was having no injury, a 5-month-old infant in her womb. Terrorists don't bother as to, they have no sympathy, no empathy. They just of a very violent mindset. And there have been nearly 66 listed explosions in aircraft. And aircrafts usually crash either at takeoff or landing. It's extremely rare for an aircraft to crash from above 30,000 feet. And any of these explosions are the reason for such air crashes. And at about 30,000 feet, this particular flight was at 31,000 feet when this happened, means there will be rapid decompression, there will be hypoxia.
Yes.
And according to the Canadian investigation, out of only 132 bodies were recovered out of 329, out of which 8 had what is called as the flail pattern injuries with diaphragmatic and chest injuries, which suggests that the plane had broken up in midair, and
yes,
these 8 bodies were thrown out of the aircraft in midair. Then 26 had hypoxia, which means that because it's about 30,000, when an explosion occurs, there is no time for you to grab an oxygen mask or anything. So these people died of lack of oxygen before they hit the sea. 25 explosive decompression injuries were found. That is because suddenly from a compressed cabin at that height, you are into a low pressure area. So your lungs extra will just explode because of the low pressure outside. So there were explosive decompression injuries, and it is expected that these 25 were near the window. Another 23 were found to have injuries due to vertical force. Now, when you fall from a height of such great height, the gravitation will cause your body to keep accelerating at a very rapid rate, and the G forces can be tremendous. We talk about G forces in aircraft pilots and Air Force pilots especially, and spacecrafts. But those are 5G, 7G. This can be nearly 100G. I mean, the acceleration is so tremendous. So another 23 had these kind of injuries. And there were another 21 whose skin had all been ripped by the accelerating force and the air resistance. Do you remember that spacecrafts which come back to Earth, I mean like the space shuttle, etc., they have extensive heat thermal coating to prevent them from being burnt up as they come in, like meteorites burn up. So there was a lot of heat injuries, and the clothes and extra were ripped off, and the rest were all drowned. And the drowning was identified because they had inhaled seawater into their lungs, and their lungs were full of water, which suggested they were died of drowning. So you see all these kind of injuries, and an explosion can also cause shrapnel injuries. where the pieces of metal, either from the bomb itself or from the parts of the plane body, can pierce you. Most of these injuries, when the aircraft crashes into the water, the parts of the aircraft crashes into the water, those who survive the fall are killed by, one, the impact of hitting the water. See, the water has got a severe surface tension. So if you hit water at a very high speed, the water doesn't part. It is like hitting a concrete wall, and you get completely smashed up. And whereas there are, when crashes occur on land, like the Lockerbie bomb air crash, you may be affected by smoke and fire after the plane catches fire after landing. But here it was drowning, and these are all the things. So by high impact on hitting the water, it will also kill you. And deceleration, that is the gravitational thing that I was talking about. When a body suddenly decelerates, you can have all your internal organs ripped apart inside you. So you may not be bleeding outside, but you will be bleeding inside your body, and at such a massive rate that you go into shock and coma immediately.
Right.
Now, the other question is, which is often asked about such people, is, are they conscious of what is happening to them, or are they not conscious of what happening to them? Most of these people would have been killed or gone into coma instantaneously. The rest who landed alive in the water, they would have, many of them would have also undergone deceleration injuries and would have lost consciousness. But those who drowned obviously were conscious and were helpless. And remember, this was off the Irish coast where the water was freezing. So it is not only drowning, you may also freeze to death.
And Dr.
So
Rao,
these are the various ways.
Dr. Rao, there's no indication, of course, of how many people were actually alive at the time of the bomb blast. Those who, the exact numbers that actually made it, it's maybe, and we don't want to speculate on that either, but you're right that there was some indication that a few people actually did manage to make it alive once the explosion happened. And then of course they just find themselves free falling into, as you've indicated, the freezing water, and they've died from drowning rather than the impact of the explosion. And these, one can maybe take a guess, were some of the people who were sitting further away from the actual site of the explosion, people who were probably sitting in the business and the premium class of the aircraft.
Usually when these things happen, most of these explosions have been due to an explosion in the baggage compartment, like it was in this case. And
yes,
the baggage compartment is below, depending on where that baggage is placed. And the baggage, the baggage with the explosives on this flight were placed near the electric systems of that aircraft. And it would have disabled not only dismembered the aircraft, it also disabled the aircraft. And the explosion, wherever it occurred, that part of the body, whoever is sitting above the baggage compartment, more than the business class, whoever is sitting above it would have been instantaneously killed. And as this shows, that those people who are near the windows were also killed. Usually in aircraft, and none of the, out of the 329 victims, only 132 bodies were recovered. So we really don't have a post-mortem on the rest of the bodies. They have sunk into the depths of the sea and were never recovered. And one other issue, none of the 22 crew members' bodies were found, and those were the 22 Indians on that flight. The rest were 268 were of Indian origin but Canadian citizens. 27 were UK citizens, and another 12 nationalities they were never very sure about. It is 22 Indian crew, which were the Indians on that flight. It was an Indian flight, but 22 Indian crew. None of their bodies was found.
yes.
So since nearly 2/3 of the bodies were never found, we don't know, we don't have a post-mortem on that.
Dr. Rao, interestingly, the report also says pathological examination failed to reveal any injuries indicative of a fire or explosion. So why do you think, there was, when we say pathological examination, what do you think this means?
See, in more, like I said initially, most aircraft accidents occur either at takeoff or landing, not in midair. And what happens when you are taking off, especially, is that the aircraft is full of aviation fuel, and that catches fire. The other problem is that nowadays they have put fire retardant materials inside the aircraft. Otherwise, the seat, the foam would catch fire and people would get asphyxiated and burnt. So this is why they have mentioned this. But in this case, there was a sudden explosion. Some people were thrown out of the aircraft. The others landed up inside the aircraft. And remember, at that height, very unlikely anyone was wearing a seat belt, because usually it is during takeoff, landing, and during turbulent weather that people are asked to wear seat belts. So many of the people wouldn't even be wearing seat belts and would have got thrown. And the reason why seat belts are compulsory in all fast moving, not only aircraft, but all fast moving vehicles, is you will get thrown at the seats in front or on the rooftop, or you can be thrown backwards, and you can have fatal injuries due to that. And you would have seen that in many car crashes, the person wearing the seat belt may survive. The people not wearing the seat belt will be killed. One famous example is Princess Diana's car crash, where the only person who survived out of the four was the one who was wearing a seat belt. So at this height, in mid-flight, very few people will actually be wearing a seat belt.
Absolutely. And Dr. Rao, I'll come back to you in a moment, and I'll just take our viewers through some other bits of the report. As Dr. Rao has explained in great detail what some of these injuries actually indicate. So let's look at what the report also says about them. In the testimony to the court, Wing Commander Dr. I.R. Hill further stated the significance of the flail injuries. Remember, we noted here flail pattern injuries were exhibited by 8 bodies. 5 of these were in zone E, 1 in zone D and 2 in zone C. These indicated that the aircraft had been broken in mid-air at an altitude, and that the victims had come out of the aeroplane at that altitude. He further explained that if an explosion had occurred in the cargo hold, it was possible that the bodies may not show any signs of an explosion, which is what was found in the report as well. None of the bodies from zone A or zone B were actually recovered. As Dr. Rao was also pointing out earlier, none of the bodies from these zones were recovered. In fact, as per the seating plan, zone B was supposed to have been unoccupied. This was the zone which was directly above the forward cargo compartment, where it is suspected that the blast actually took place. Dr. Hill further stated that the pattern of the accident, as suggested by the injuries, indicated that it was a complex affair, and there were at least 2 phases of injuries, one in the air and one at the water impact. In answer to a specific question that if there was an explosive device in the cargo hold, then could the passengers who were seated have suffered such injuries, the answer of Dr. Hill was that it is possible. So he was asked specifically that, do you think that those who were seated near the cargo hold could have suffered the sort of injuries that were seen on the bodies of some of the victims? He said that it is possible. According to him, the pattern of the injuries indicated that if there was an explosion in the aircraft, pattern of the injuries indicated that if there was an explosion in the aircraft, it was more likely that the explosion had occurred in the rear cargo compartment than in the front cargo compartment. This conclusion was apparently based on the fact that, according to him, in zone E of the aircraft, there were larger vertical load types. Dr. Hale was also asked if he had any suggestions which would minimize injuries to passengers in the event of an accident. In this answer, of course, he gives a lot of details. These are, of course, I'm showing to you now further pages of the Justice BN Kirpal report, where Air Vice Marshal Kunzru, witness number 10 in his report dated 14th November 1985, just months after the June 23rd bomb blast, gave his comments not only on the post-mortem reports but also on the statement of Wing Commander Dr. I.R. Hill. He said all victims have been stated in the post-mortem reports to have died of multiple injuries. However, 2 of the dead, 1 infant and 1 child, are reported to have died of asphyxia. There is no doubt about the asphyxial death of the infant. In the case of the other child, there is no doubt, because the findings could also be caused due to the child undergoing tumbling or spinning with the anchor point of the ankles. Air Vice Marshal Kunzru generally agreed with the crash injury analysis of the victims, which has been furnished by Wing Commander Dr. Hill. He, however, gave the following with regard to hypoxia, decompression and decelerative changes. Of course, there goes an explanation, of course, of hypoxia and decompression. The main post-mortem report findings in hypoxia is generalized congestion. For decompression, the term used by Dr. Hill is decompression. It is presumed that he means rapid explosive decompression, which occurs within 1 second, and not decompression sickness, which takes a minimum of 5 to 7 minutes to occur at an altitude of 31,000 feet. The post-mortem and histological signs of rapid decompression are possibility of rupture of eardrums. So this is where, of course, there is an explanation of what were some of the signs and symptoms that led the experts back then to come to these sort of conclusions, that these were the sort of injuries that were suffered by the people. Remember, most of the bodies that were recovered were also very difficult to perform a post-mortem on because of the nature of the tragedy. Possibility of rupture of eardrums without any injury to the skull, patchy lung hemorrhage, and these occur more commonly in those cases where the individual was in the phase of breathing in at the time of decompression. And this, of course, is the end of this aspect of injuries to the people. But what's truly extremely sad, as we've been discussing with Dr. Rao, Dr. Rao, these are of course reports, sir, and they end up reducing people to mere numbers. When we say 30 children, 12 children, 23 bodies, 21 bodies, 49 bodies, 25 bodies, these were all people, sir. This was someone's family. These were children, these were babies who, like I said in the beginning, became victims to the worst terror attack, one of the worst in the history up until 9/11, and even after that, we must remember that this happened. The fact that India was able to come up with its report and its finding within months of the crash, and Canada since 1985 took up until 2010 to actually release its own findings and reports. What does that indicate to you about those who were possibly in power and their need to maybe suppress what was going on?
Devika, before that, if you may allow me, I want to say hypoxia is lack of oxygen. For those who don't know this medical term, it is at that height where there is very low oxygen levels. That is what hypoxia deaths mean. And as far as explosive decompression means, is that wherever there is air inside the body, which is at surface, because it's a pressurized cabin, it is at normal atmospheric pressure. But when the aeroplane suddenly explodes and opens out, outside the air pressure is so low that wherever there is air inside your body, it will rapidly expand, and that is what the mention of eardrums being ruptured because of the air inside the ear, the face, your cheeks, etc. will blow out, and the chest will blow out, and the diaphragm will rupture. So this is what they mean by that. Okay, coming back to your comment. See, we as doctors spend our life trying to save one life here, and we may spend days trying to save a life or save a limb. So for us, this is very painful that terrorists are involved with mindless violence, killing people innocent people whom they don't even know, men, women, children, and even pregnant people. They don't care whom they are killing. And this is very painful to us. And as to what happened from the Canadian side and by the Indian side, this is not the only such tragedy that Canada has had. It has had other tragedies, and very sad that in this particular case, there was specific information saying that the Air India flight is going to be attacked. And as we say in medicine, prevention is better than cure. Here, a person was asked specifically to put a bomb on the plane, a Canadian, white Canadian. He refused, and he told the Canadian police that there is a plan like this. Another person who came to know about it because the person who was assembling the bomb was trying to buy explosives, trying to buy the explosive cap and various other things like the timer, etc. They have mentioned. Then an undercover agent of the Canadian police had even recorded it and put it across to them. A criminal who was trying to reduce his sentence had also revealed that he had been about this information. And Air India had, and the government of India had specifically asked that all baggages should be specifically checked with X-ray. And that particular day, the X-ray machine broke down. Second, a person who didn't have a confirmed booking, his baggage was allowed to be loaded onto the aircraft. And thirdly, Air India had specifically asked for checking of baggage before it was loading, and with a handheld explosive sensor. And though this bag showed some indication of it, the Canadians who were checking this bag ignored it, thinking that it was a very weak signal, and allowed this bag in. So at every step there has been lack of application of mind by the Canadians. And then, of course, like you said, it was only in 2010 that they put out this report. And they have been desperately trying to evade being held responsible for all this, because it is not only the perpetrators of this, but also the Canadian authorities who had information and who at every step showed negligence. So they were trying to avoid being held responsible for this and being asked to pay reparations towards this. This is in sharp contrast to what happened on the Lockerbie air crash, where the Libyans who blew up the Pan Am aircraft over the Lockerbie village of Scotland, where people died, not only who were on the flight, but people on the ground where the aircraft crashed, even they died. And the Americans and British were very quick in doing their investigation. They forced the Libyan authorities to hand over the culprits, and they took action against them. And reparations were also made. Libya was made to pay reparations, and reparations were paid to all the victims' relatives. There is a sharp contrast between the way these two were handled. And though 268 of the 329 were Canadian citizens and 27 were UK citizens, they were not of they were of Indian origin, and hence I think there was a major difference in the way the Canadians handled this and the way the Americans handled the Pan Am Lockerbie crash.
Absolutely. Dr. Rao, thank you so much for joining us on the broadcast, sir. Your views, I'm sure, have helped the viewers also understand, because like I said, today before us we just have some pages to understand what actually happened, but these were real people who felt the impact real time, and then they had family that was probably waiting on them to come back home, and they never made it. And the people who were behind this attack went scot-free. That's truly, truly tragic.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.